On New Year's Day, 1886 in London, a man was discovered dead in his Pimlico flat. He had a lethal dose of chloroform in his stomach, but no burns anywhere in his throat. Chloroform is caustic. It destroys tissue on contact. For it to reach the stomach without leaving a mark, Victorian surgeons had no explanation. Neither has anyone since. It became one of the biggest questions Victorian medicine could not answer. This is the story of Adelaide Bartlett and the Pimlico poisoning of 1886. Adelaide Blanche de la Trémoille was born in Orléans, France, in 1855. Her origins were complicated, but it's clear she was French-born. Her mother was an Englishwoman named Clara Chamberlain. Her father has never been definitively established, but the most persistent rumor attached itself to a French aristocrat named Adolphe Collot de la Trémouille, Comte de Thouars d'Escurie, who had connections to Queen Victoria's entourage during a 1855 visit to France. This detail was never confirmed, and it was never entirely dismissed. Adelaide's origins remained a point of speculation throughout her life and throughout the trial. The records confirm that by 1860 her father had died and was buried in London's Pancras district, and her mother followed him in 1866, passing away at the age of 33. Adelaide, somewhere around 10 or 11 years old, was effectively orphaned. By the time the 1871 census was recorded, she was living in Hampton Wick in Middlesex, listed as the adopted daughter of a confectioner named William Wellbeloved. She was 19 years old when she married Thomas Edwin Bartlett on the 6th of April 1875 at Croydon Parish Church. The man was 29 years old. He came from a prosperous South London family with a growing chain of grocery shops, a business he ran with considerable success. What their marriage actually was, in practice, behind closed doors, became one of the central contested questions at the Old Bailey a decade later. Adelaide testified, through her defense, that the marriage was platonic almost from the beginning. Edwin held unconventional views on marriage. He thought a man could have two wives, one for companionship and intellectual engagement, and another for physical duties. After they got married, he sent her to school, wanting an educated companion. Throughout most of their marriage, she said, they deliberately kept their relationship non-physical. But there was one exception. In 1881, Adelaide gave birth to a stillborn child. During labor, Edwin refused a male doctor's presence, fearing interference with his wife. Consequently, she labored without proper medical attention, and the experience wasn't something she spoke fondly of. Edwin's family, particularly his father, had never liked Adelaide. The elder Bartlett had at various points accused her of carrying on with Edwin's younger brother, Frederick. However, there was no proof of that. But it tells you something about the household she had married into, and something about how quickly suspicion would turn in her direction when Edwin died. In early 1885, the Bartletts started attending Wesleyan chapel services in Merton, Surrey. Their minister was a young man named George Dyson, 27, pale with close-cropped whiskers and a heavy, dark moustache. He held a Bachelor of Arts from Trinity College, Dublin, and was earnest and educated. Edwin Bartlett took to him almost immediately. What followed was one of the stranger domestic arrangements documented in Victorian England, though whether it was as innocent as it appeared, or as Edwin later described it, depends on who you believe. Edwin invited Dyson to tutor Adelaide in history, geography, Latin, and mathematics. He paid for a railway season ticket so that Dyson could travel from Putney to visit them freely without financial inconvenience. He made Dyson co-executor of his will and wrote him letters of remarkable warmth. One letter, introduced at trial, read in part, "Who can help loving you? I feel I must say to you 2 words, thank you," and he signed it, "Yours affectionately, Edwin." Dyson visited so frequently that he kept personal items at the Bartlett flat. The housemaid would later testify to walking in on Adelaide and Dyson in positions that were not those of a tutor and student. Edwin witnessed them kiss, and by his own reported words, he not only permitted it but approved. He had told Adelaide, according to her account, that he was giving her to Dyson, that if Edwin died, Dyson would marry her. Edwin also revised his will during this period. Originally, he had left everything to Adelaide on the condition that she not remarry, but about 4 months before his death, he removed that condition entirely. Whether Edwin's arrangement was a genuine expression of his unconventional beliefs, manipulation, or an invented explanation for something more calculated, that is a question the trial examined and declined to answer. What the trial did establish is that by the autumn of 1885, George Dyson was at the center of the Bartlett household, and that by December of that year, Adelaide had asked him to do something that he would later call the most suspicious act of his life, though he claimed at the time to see nothing wrong in it at all. From the beginning of December 1885, Edwin Bartlett's health deteriorated sharply. His teeth had been a problem for years. A dentist had at some earlier point sawed his teeth down to the gum line rather than extracting them properly, leaving stumps and rotting roots embedded in the jaw. By December, the resulting infection had become serious, and Edwin was experiencing significant dental pain alongside a persistent gastric illness. His doctor, Dr. Alfred Leach, was attending him regularly at 85 Claverton Street and had diagnosed him with subacute gastritis. Adelaide was considered by Leach to be an attentive and capable nurse. At some point that month, Adelaide raised the subject of chloroform. She gave Dr. Leach more than one explanation for why she wanted it. She told him she had used it previously, sprinkled on a handkerchief, to help Edwin sleep during periods of insomnia. She also told him, separately, that Edwin had recently revived his interest in the physical side of their marriage, and that she intended to wave chloroform on a handkerchief before his face to suppress that interest when it arose. Leach found the request irregular, so he declined to supply it himself, but eventually, under pressure from Edwin himself, he wrote a prescription. Around the 27th of December, Adelaide asked Dyson to obtain the chloroform for her. The way he went about it is one of the more striking details of the case. Under Victorian law, purchasing larger quantities of certain chemical substances required signing a register at the chemist. Smaller individual purchases did not. Rather than buy one bottle and sign the book, Dyson visited 4 separate chemists and bought a small bottle from each, telling every one of them that he needed chloroform to remove grease stains from clothing. He then combined the contents into a single bottle and handed it to Adelaide. He later said he did not understand, at the time, how suspicious this looked. He had procured somewhere between 4 and 5 ounces in total. Adelaide put the bottle somewhere in the flat. Neither she nor anyone else would account clearly for what happened to it after Edwin's death. By the 30th of December, Edwin appeared to be recovering. Dr. Leach visited and told him he was nearly well and had no need of further medical attention. On the 31st, the couple went together to see the dentist. Witnesses who saw them that day described them as affectionate. One account records Edwin saying that he wished they could start over so he could have the pleasure of marrying Adelaide again. That evening, Edwin ate a substantial supper, jugged hare, bread, cake, and oysters. He spoke to the housemaid and asked her to make sure there was a large haddock ready for his breakfast in the morning, adding that he thought he would get up an hour early for the pleasure of it. He also told the maid to arrange a particularly good dinner for January 1st. Clearly, he was in good spirits. Adelaide slept at the foot of the bed, as had become their practice during his illness, so she could watch over him through the night without disturbing him. Somewhere before 4 o'clock on the morning of January 1st, 1886, she woke up. Edwin was face down, apparently unconscious. She attempted to revive him with brandy before sending the maid to fetch Dr. Leach and went to rouse the landlady. To the landlord she said, "Come down, I think Mr. Bartlett is dead." Dr. Leach arrived and confirmed that Edwin Bartlett was dead. However, the cause was not immediately apparent. The body appeared in reasonable physical condition aside from the known dental and gastric illness. It would very possibly have ended there, a man with a known illness, a grieving wife, and no obvious signs of violence, except for Edwin's father. The elder Bartlett had never trusted Adelaide. He had been kept from his son's sick room during Edwin's illness, sent away at the door on more than one occasion. He arrived at the flat after the death and was made to wait 26 minutes in the smoking room before anyone saw him. When Adelaide finally appeared, she put her arms around his neck and told him not to fret, that she would make sure he never went without, and that things would be just the same as if Edwin were alive. He accepted the embrace. Then he went upstairs and, by his own testimony, bent over his son's body and smelled it for prussic acid. He was suspicious before he had a single fact to be suspicious about, and he pushed hard until the authorities agreed to open an inquest. The post-mortem was conducted within days of Edwin's death, with further expert examination following shortly after. Surgeons, including Sir James Paget, were involved. The initial examination found the body in surprisingly sound condition. Then they opened the stomach. The smell of chloroform was immediate. Further analysis confirmed a lethal quantity of liquid chloroform in the stomach, approximately 1 ounce, according to the most consistent accounts. And then came the detail that made this case unforgettable. There were no burns anywhere, in his mouth, throat, or windpipe. Every surface the chloroform would have had to pass through was completely intact. That created an impossible problem. If Edwin swallowed it voluntarily, he would have had to gulp it down so fast, in a single motion, that the liquid bypassed the upper tissue before it could react. Victorian medical experts considered this extraordinarily unlikely. Chloroform also has a strongly unpleasant taste that typically triggers vomiting on contact. If someone else administered it by force or poured it in while he was unconscious, the burns would still be expected, and there would likely be traces in the lungs. But there were none. There was also no chloroform left anywhere in the flat. Adelaide had disposed of the bottle. She told Dyson she had thrown it, contents and all, from a railway carriage. The coroner's inquest found Adelaide Bartlett guilty of willful murder and George Dyson an accessory before the fact. Both were subsequently arrested. The trial opened at the Central Criminal Court in mid-April 1886. The public interest was considerable, evidenced by the large crowds gathering outside the Old Bailey and the additional railings erected. Furthermore, the press extensively covered the proceedings on both sides of the Atlantic. Even the New York Times ran extensive dispatches. The case had everything the Victorian reading public found compelling: a French-born woman of mysterious origins, a dead grocer, a Wesleyan minister, and a marriage arrangement that would have raised eyebrows in any drawing room in England. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General, Sir Charles Russell. The defense retained Sir Edward Clarke, widely considered the finest barrister in late Victorian England. Clarke's decision to take the case was rumoured to have been secured through the intervention of Adelaide's shadowy, high-ranking father, the one who was never named and never appeared. The prosecution's first move at trial was to drop all charges against George Dyson. This allowed them to call him as a prosecution witness. It also, as Clarke well understood, gave the defense the opportunity to take him apart on cross-examination. Adelaide herself could not testify. Under the law as it stood in 1886, defendants were not permitted to give evidence on their own behalf. That right would not come until the Criminal Evidence Act of 1898. Everything that Adelaide had said, everything that explained her conduct, had to come through other means. Here's what the trial heard in evidence. The housemaid testified to the intimacy between Adelaide and Dyson, including his season ticket, letters, and Edwin kissing Dyson goodbye. She also mentioned Edwin's satisfaction at the prospect of Dyson marrying Adelaide after his death. Dr. Leach testified about Edwin's illness and Adelaide's nursing, and he confirmed his own reluctant role in the prescription for chloroform. Dyson took the stand and explained in detail how he had purchased 4 small bottles from 4 different chemists. He combined them to avoid the register. He recounted Adelaide's advice after Edwin's death and before suspicion became public. She urged him to completely forget about the chloroform and never mention it. He also described her telling him she had thrown the bottle from a train. When he finally told her he intended to tell the truth to the coroner, he described her saying, "If you don't incriminate me, I don't incriminate you." However, Sir Clarke cross-examined Dyson methodically. He drew out the fact that Dyson had thrown away his 4 small bottles himself, unprompted, while walking across Wandsworth Common on the Sunday before Edwin's death was known to involve foul play. He pressed Dyson on whether the judge's final summation to the jury had any bearing on his credibility. The judge had suggested that Dyson took advantage of Edwin's peculiar state of mind to supplant him in his wife's affections. Could a man accused of such conduct be relied upon as a witness? The judge, in his summation, advised the jury not to trust Dyson's testimony uncritically. The prosecution brought in its forensic expert, Sir Thomas Stevenson, to address the central mystery. How had the chloroform reached Edwin's stomach without burning his throat? Stevenson confirmed it was the only substance present and that the quantity was lethal. Under Clarke's cross-examination, he conceded, reluctantly, that self-administration was physically possible, though he considered it extremely unlikely. Clarke's closing argument ran 6 hours. He offered the suicide theory, that Edwin, knowing he was dying, knowing Adelaide had been given to Dyson, possibly having been told on that final night that the chloroform existed and was meant to suppress his advances, drank it himself as a final act of renunciation. He presented Edwin's own eccentricities, his belief in animal magnetism and his reported feeling of snakes crawling inside him, as evidence of a man in an unstable mental state capable of unusual behavior. He pointed to Adelaide's behavior after Edwin's death. She hadn't fled, but instead actively encouraged a post-mortem. Furthermore, she held on to the chloroform bottle for several days after his death, only disposing of it after the post-mortem was conducted and suspicion became public. Clarke argued that a guilty woman would have destroyed the evidence the night her husband died, not days later. What the prosecution could not counter, and what Clarke kept returning to, was the central forensic impossibility. There was no mechanism that anyone could explain. No one had been able to say how the chloroform got into Edwin's stomach, and if the prosecution could not answer that question, they could not prove that Adelaide had been the one to put it there. There were details the jury also had to weigh. 6 condoms and a guide on sexual conduct were found in Edwin's coat pocket, complicating Adelaide's account of their platonic arrangement and Edwin's supposed lack of interest in the physical. Edwin had told his maid to prepare a sumptuous dinner and ordered haddock for breakfast. These are not the preparations of a man who intends to die before morning. After a short deliberation, the jury returned. The foreman stood and delivered one of the more unusual acquittal statements in the history of the Old Bailey. Although we think grave suspicion is attached to the prisoner, we do not think there is sufficient evidence to show how or by whom the chloroform was administered. Not guilty. The courtroom erupted into applause, but the judge's contemptuous expression was unmistakable. Public opinion had shifted dramatically over the 6 days of the trial, and the outside crowd was celebrating. Adelaide Bartlett walked out of the Old Bailey in her widow's clothing, acquitted and free, and effectively vanished from the public record. George Dyson disappeared alongside her, almost immediately. What became of either of them is one of those questions that research keeps circling without landing. The authors of a 1939 biography of Sir Edward Clarke noted an impression that Adelaide and Dyson may eventually have married, then admitted they had also heard the opposite, that the two never met again after the trial. Later accounts place Adelaide in Connecticut, where one account suggests she died sometime after 1933. A woman in Maryland claimed in 1939 that Dyson had come to the United States under a different name and had married and killed another woman for her estate in 1916. Methodist Church records, on the other hand, suggest Dyson emigrated to Australia. None of these accounts has been confirmed. None has been entirely ruled out. There was no confession ever made, no letter emerged, and no deathbed statement. Sir James Paget's remark after Adelaide's acquittal has haunted this case ever since. He was not speaking lightly. He was one of the most distinguished surgeons in Victorian England, a man for whom, I don't know, was not a comfortable position. And he did not know. Most criminologists and historians who have looked closely at this case believe Adelaide killed her husband. A smaller number hold open the possibility of suicide, particularly given Edwin's state of mind in those final weeks, his known eccentricities, and the absence of any physical evidence of struggle. A third possibility, that the full story involved both Adelaide and Dyson in ways neither ever admitted, has never been established. What the case left behind is the forensic puzzle itself. The case presented a single ounce of liquid chloroform in a deceased man's stomach, accompanied by no burns, a lack of a mechanism, and an explanation that Victorian science and subsequent scientific endeavors have yet to fully satisfy. The case was dramatized on BBC Radio in 1952 under the title 4 Small Bottles. Then a 4-part television series titled A Question of Guilt aired in 1980. The Jodie Foster film Mesmerized, released in 1985, was loosely adapted from the same events. However, none of them answered the question Sir James Paget asked. Adelaide Bartlett's fate was sealed as she left the Old Bailey. Whether she also grasped the unsolved mystery that accompanied her, the secret she carried with her wherever she went, remains unknown. Thank you for watching, and if you're watching from the UK, especially London, drop a comment below and let me know whether you'd heard of the Pimlico poisoning before today. It was national news in 1886, and the address, Claverton Street, still exists. See you guys later.